Good. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. This is our first Walking Writers Salon of the year. And I think actually looking around the room, everybody knows something about Walk, Listen, Create, but just in case you don't, we're supporting artists, performers, writers, and anyone else who creates work on foot or about walking. And we run creative writing workshops and writing competitions, of which we've just launched one. So it's a writing for audio competition. So I hope some of you will have a go at that. We have 2 writers in residence, and you can read their introductory blog pieces on the website. And that's Shani Cadwallander and Amelia Hodson. And they're about to launch a series of salons on eco writing. And we're also supporting Anne Forrest, who is running a series of Walking America conversations between writers. So the good news is we're going to have a greater variety of hosts and a greater variety of topics and guests. And today's guest is, for me, is someone I first met this guest I think in 2005. I'm sort of scratching my head, Phil, whether it was sooner or not, but it was at a Walk 21 conference, and I think he sort of he and his team from Rights and Sites, I think pretty much silenced the auditorium because they were kind of a bit caught out by what Rights and Sites did, but it was a very entertaining presentation. Anyway, I'm going to be chatting to Phil to begin with, then we open it up to the audience, and then the fantastic news is we have an incredibly complicated multiple choice quiz, and Phil has offered up a prize of a copy of The Common as a prize for the multiple choice quiz winner. So Phil is an associate professor, a reader, an academic researcher, writer, and artist specializing in walking, site-specific performance, dramaturgy, and mythogeography. I have to be absolutely honest, I'm not totally convinced I know what mythogeography is all about, so I'm hoping that Phil's going to expand on that a little bit. But first, I think, Phil, you're actually going to open with a poem, is that right?
Yeah, I think I will. So it's a poem from this book, if I can hold it, The Common. And yeah, I should read something about walking, shouldn't I, really? But I'm going to be perverse and just read one that I enjoy. So it's quite short. So it's called Adagio. Under the shade of plane trees, we got to discussing durational musical compositions. John Cage, Eric Satie were mentioned, Jem Finer's Long Player, of course. Then we got to talking about time, and one of us told the other of how the bursar of a Cambridge college with a troublesome wooden beam had delegated a member of its teaching staff to visit a workshop in nearby woodland, where the carpenter looked over the work order and said, well, we've been waiting for this for the best part of 300 years, and showed the tutor the vast racks of seasoned wood ready for when needed. Then one of us left the other and set off for the hospital to have their operation for the removal of a cancerous organ, while the other, returning home, noticed for the first time how the unwanted oak tabletop that some weeks before he had put out in the rain was sprouting again.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you very much for reading that. I actually thoroughly enjoyed reading many of the poems. There were 1 or 2 which completely confused me, but I have to put my hand up.
My job is done.
And you say in the sort of preface that you've written poetry before, but this is the first time you've really done a sort of sustained effort to write poetry. In fact, you've you've authored and co-authored numerous books. So writing itself, does that come naturally to you?
That's a difficult question to ask, partly because I'm not quite sure what naturally means in the context of writing. It certainly doesn't necessarily come easily, although I do seem to do an awful lot of it. So that would seem to contradict just the amount of stuff that I seem to be able to write. But I find it much more enjoyable to have written rather than in the process of writing, which might be itself a bit of a lure or a bit of a trap.
I mean, the other thing is that what you've done, which I wish I'd done, I hadn't sort of worked it out myself, but what you've done is you've made quite a lot of performances or pieces of work, and then craftily published a book which has either documented or explored further whatever you've been doing in that piece.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm a mug not to have done it myself. But you've done that. I mean, was that always a sort of intention? Whenever you make work, you always have been thinking about how it could become a book.
Strangely, not really. I think almost always in the cases that you're describing, there were strong elements of chance and accident involved. I might point to the case of writing together with Alison Hallett, for example. We'd met up and chatted about maybe writing something together about walking, and we thought about how we might put together a number of sort of tasks that we would both do, and then we'd write about the realization of that. And just as we were about to do that, Alison's hip totally gave way, and eventually she had to have a replacement. And I contracted a mystery illness, which was never diagnosed, but that essentially confined me to the house for 3 months or more. So suddenly we had to write about not being able to walk, and in fact we weren't really writing, we were just writing back and forward to each other emails, and then realized that actually the emails were sort of constituting the writing that we were making, and so we constructed the book as a sort of dialogue in a way. So very often, no, I'm not really thinking about how can I use this performance or use this walk. Generally, it's far too involving what you're actually in the midst of to be sort of contemplating how to turn it into prose or into art or whatever.
Okay, so we as I mentioned in the introduction, you've done a bit of writing of poetry in the past, but this is a kind of sustained effort now, and you've produced. I mean, most people's poetry collection you get is a sort of kind of pamphlet about 20 poems. Now, I mean, watch out, folks. This is a huge tome, great stuff in it. But you've obviously had a sort of kind of sustained effort. What's made the change? I mean, you got tired of walking art.
Well, a lot of the writing in the common is based on walks. I mean, the huge central poem called, surprisingly, The Common, is based on a walk I took with a researcher in pilgrimage, and she wanted to interview me, and so she lives up in Salford, I'm in Plymouth, and so we arranged to meet in Coventry, which is about sort of halfway in between, but was also where I grew up. And we went on a sort of pilgrimage while she interviewed me about pilgrimage. and that whole poem, it comes out of that walk, and some of the things that were discovered on it. So for example, we were walking towards my old primary school, down a road which is called Coat of Arms Bridge Road, which has the coat of arms bridge on it, which is a bridge with a coat of arms on it. And as we were approaching it, I said to Emmy, I think that just beyond the bridge, if my memory is right, there's sort of woodland and there's a little footpath. And as a child, I would never, ever go up that footpath, because I knew that at the top of the footpath was the witch's cottage. And it was just too terrifying to contemplate walking up there. Anyway, we passed under the bridge, and sure enough, there were the woods and there was the footpath. And I said, well, you know, now we can do this. I can walk this for the first time. So we walked up the path and through the trees. And I said to him, you know, don't be disappointed. There probably isn't even you know, any building here. Anyway, there it was, this 17th century cottage, a little stream of smoke rising up from the chimney, a little white wicket gate, sort of classic fairy tale cottage. And as we sort of drew level with it, the back door opened, and out into the garden came a woman with long white hair, a long grey shawl, 90 if she was a day, and there was the witch, and she smiled and waved to me, and I smiled and waved back to her, and there was nothing else to be said, really. I mean, it was just an extraordinary connection. So I'm not thinking at that moment, wow, I'm going to write a poem about this. I'm just kind of, wow, I am here. I can't believe it. This woman must have been here when I was last here 60 years ago. And she was a young woman then. I was a tiny child. And here we are across 60 years meeting, and without the misunderstanding, so to speak, that I would have had back then, and that was enough, you know. So it's only later on that I started to think, actually, that's quite significant, you know, and actually that connection speaks to other things, and then the poem grows and grows.
No, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, do you find that, you know, with poetry, you're having to leave more to the imagination of the reader, or than you do? I mean, yeah, some people may not know, but Phil used to write plays. I don't know whether you still write plays, but you've also written prose. So do you find with poetry, you know, you have to you know, draw less on it, or it's almost cutting away so much and leaving more to the imagination? Or do you find that's not the case?
I don't know whether it's leaving to the imagination. There's certainly a sort of concentration in poetry that perhaps isn't there in prose. And certainly I have to be very strict with myself, although it's a big book, but an awful lot of stuff was tossed into a bin or whatever, into a deleted state, let's say. So there is undoubtedly an editing process going on the whole time within individual poems, but also across a collection. But I'm not sure it's about letting in or leaving space for the imagination. I mean, I think that's there in every kind of writing and in every kind of performance. Writing or performing or of whatever kind is always a sort of invitation, isn't it? There has to be space for whoever the person is who's watching or reading to kind of come into. So there has to be an offer. There has to be a gap into which you're sort of inviting people. So I'm not sure that's special to poetry. I mean, as I point out when I'm writing in the book, I think it's in the sort of epilogue-y thing that I put in. I really do not know what I am doing with poetry. So it's you know it's like having passengers in the back of a car having never driven. So it doesn't necessarily mean we won't arrive, but there may be some scrapes and shuntings along the way. I think that's, and a lot of sort of things might pass very suddenly at times, and at other times everything might come to a halt. And I think that's probably kind of like what happens a lot of the time with the writing. So the project of the common, and it's strange because although I didn't necessarily always plan it as a project, but it sort of emerged gradually as a sort of whole project, is to try to express something that I didn't think could be done in any other form than poetry, or I began to kind of believe that it couldn't be done in any other form than in writing poetry, and that was to try to express what it feels like to have been around in the immediate post-war period in Europe. I think that's what I was trying to do, really. So and just to recognize how much my individual kind of emotional life has been affected by everything that's been going on around me or had been going on immediately before I was born. So, you know, I arrived on this continent that had been or was continuing to be racked by a Cold War and had been racked by the rise of Nazism. And my, you know, growing up in Coventry, one would hear a lot about the Blitz and hear a lot of Blitz stories, but they were often told as sort of comic stories. I remember my nan talking about my Auntie Muriel, going out one night in all their best clothes and then having to throw themselves onto the ground as bombs started to land, so that all their lovely evening gowns were completely covered in mud, and she said they just lay there and howled with laughter. So I got a sort of comic view, mostly a comic view of this. But then as I grew up and began to read and hear about the history, I began to understand that actually the experience for most people in Europe was completely different, that there was no comedy, or if there was, it was vastly overwhelmed by the awfulness and the horror of what people had experienced. At the same time, I was growing up and was very aware that we were not that far off a nuclear war. A lot of the time, sometimes it seemed closer and sometimes it seemed further away, but it was pretty constant. And as I began to talk with my father about his life as a RAF pilot, I once said to my children, now don't worry, Granddad didn't actually fight in the war. He hasn't actually been involved in any fight. And my dad said, yes, I was. I fought in the Cold War. And what he was doing was he was flying his aeroplane, his jet, at the East German border in order, I think, because towards the end of his life he had dementia, so all the official Secrets Act stuff sort of fell away. I think what he was trying to do was he's trying to trigger the East German radar so that it would light up, so that the Allies, the Western forces, would be able to see where their radar positions were. But obviously you had to pull up at the right moment, because if you cross that border, then they would fire on you. So I was kind of came into that world. I mean, my dad was then an engineer, an aircraft engineer, and we had members of the Romanian Securitate, the awful Ceausescu's dreadful sort of secret police, come and visit our house. You know, I mean, we were in the quiet little Coventry suburb, we were right in the middle of the Cold War. So I wanted to sort of kind of draw those sort of things together, really. And I didn't really, or I just started to find that writing, that when I began to write poetry, that's what I began to tap into.
Well, I was going to try and get back to a little bit on the way you've made work on foot and the walking art, because one of the things you know, which I think you've done really brilliantly, is you have provoked interaction with the people around you, and you've done that in many sometimes amusing ways, and others thoughtful, profound, and challenging ways. And you write in the book about how you actually appear to sort of almost revel in interruption or distraction, and you like to have sort of sounds around you while you're working. Yeah, I mean, is that the case with writing as well? Do you find that you write better if you've got racket and interruptions, or do you?
I'm not sure about interruption. I have music playing all the time that I'm writing, and I struggle with lyrics, so I can't necessarily have the human voice. Sometimes I can, but most of the time it's kind of electronica, or I quite like certain 20th century symphony writers like Schnittker and people like that. But a lot of the time, once I've started the writing, I've often, the music will end and I will then notice for the first time that it was playing. So I'm just disappearing into the world of whatever it is that I'm writing. And I am aware, and this is a dreadful thing to say with musicians and composers present, that so I'm using the music in some ways to push out all the other sounds, you know. So I'm forever not hearing the postman or postal worker calling to deliver parcels. The poor neighbours have to look after them for me. Yeah.
Okay, well now look, is it time for another poem? And maybe I encourage Phil to read another poem. You guys in the audience start giving us some questions in the chat, and we'll invite you to ask them. But Phil, yeah, choose another poem to read us.
Okay. So I feel a bit bad about not reading anything about walking. So I think what I'll do, this one is, I hadn't really thought of reading it, but I think I will now. And it's entirely made up of words from and phrases lifted from various guidebooks for walkers. So none of these words are my own. But I've taken them from I don't know how many sources, and then but it's my putting together of them. So it's called Derambled. Move now, return, carry on, now cross, leave the chapter house, pass behind, turn back, continue across. Don't venture on the railway track, leave the gardens, keep to the pavement, go over a corner fence, take the road, then the narrow lane, descend the steps, walk over the road, turn immediately left, retrace your steps, proceed. Turn towards the power station, take the dead end, head southwest. Don't go through the next facing gate, but do exactly what is said in the directions. You are first taken to the car park, then led on the walk with precise and clear instructions. Features of local history, superb views, what points of interest there are to be seen, a picturesque waterfall, pleasant farming country, a magnificent vista suddenly appears, a small picturesque fishing village, which is a mecca to artists, a very pleasant spot. The halcyon kingfisher, the picturesque thatched inn, splendid sundial, the impressive part of the church, the pretty main street, charming village green, delectable cottages. To reach the villages, you will probably be taking your car, but there, I'm spoiling the excitement, hardly worth looking for, the rather ugly Stone, birthplace of the notorious Joanna Southcott, whilst others are extensive tracts of monotonous mires, tedious road walking, strolls around Sidmouth using your cars. No walk is included if you might get lost, safe in the knowledge that you will eventually return to your vehicle. No guns may be used. The Black Death, perhaps. As we all walk for peace, radios should be left behind. A complaint among some farmers is walkers treat us like cattle. Country walking is not an affair of fragile stockings, Creepy Crazy Well, the Beer Depression, Fluke Hall, Boggle Hole, Doldrum Bay, Sleeve League, Holywood, the Noop, Rumblewick, Fire Hill, Rat Island, Nun Street, Hidden Bridge, Strangle Beach, Crackington Haven, Gentleman's Caves, Black Gang, Lower Slaughter, Brock's Ire Places, and the Glory Hole Church Centre. The famous bottle kicking contest, a railway with granite tracks. Although there are no toilets at Shipley, they tend to be seasonable. Drewer is one of many words used for the devil, daddy being another. Many visitors make a pilgrimage to witness something that isn't there. The 199 steps immortalized by Stoker, where you will appear to be walking on water to anyone on one arch bridge. Near here, you should see your first puffin. The smell from droppings can be overpowering. The poet Coleridge, who lived by the river Sid, wrote another called Alf. Pick up the coach path by the Witchcraft Museum, past the anti-aircraft gun, walk ahead to return to your car. Make no unnecessary noise. Toy Cottage, a hoard of sling stones, known internationally as a scythe-making centre, cider mania. Time alters details with astonishing speed. Signposts may change, woods may be planted or cleared, hedge banks may evaporate. The land is all owned by somebody. We have assured them that walkers will go quietly. You have a firm right, at least 700 years old, and men have died for this liberty. There is, strangely, no right to stop, whether to have a picnic or simply to gaze at the view. There is only one place in this little book which could possibly be called unique, just fresh and varied and British, not stupendous, colossal or terrific, good for dogs, not for nylons. A narrow path across a huge cornfield does very little harm. Christ and his disciples used such paths.
Well, there we go. Thank you. That's really good. Now, I'm aware that Bob is off for barbecue on the beach and he wants to get away smartly, but he's asked a question. So, Bob, over to you. You've got to unmute yourself, Bob.
Okay, this is my question. Now, Schnittke used collage in his musical practice. For example, it'd be kind of like that. Now, do you use collage in your practice in a similar way, or do you use that as inspirational?
Oh, that's very interesting. I have used collage, and I'll tell you how I've used it. Sometimes I've found that I'm writing two poems simultaneously, or writing two poems around the same time, but neither is working. And so what I have done is in a really quite a sort of brutal way, is chop the poems up and then collage them together. And then sort of begun again, really, to sort of rework as if that was a kind of raw material for me. So, I'm surprising myself by saying yes.
And in a phenomenological sense, do you apply that to your, living life? Does it affect you? I.e., when you collage your poems, does that change your attitude to your own persona? Do you allow it to infiltrate your consciousness in that sense?
That is a very good question, Bob. I mean, strangely, for someone who spends a lot of time writing, I don't try to think too much about what the impact is on me. and maybe I ought to do that more. I might make better decisions by doing that. But at the same time, I think I'm trying to concentrate on the other more. I kind of want to answer your question by reading a poem, if that's okay, Bob.
Please.
It's just a short one, but it's because this might give you an idea of kind of like of how what I do affects the life that I live. And it's called Cast of Characters. The world is full of imps and spectres. At nightfall, I can barely get into my bed for all the stone giants that cluster round my mattress. They rap on the door at 2 a.m, wail over the sound. Sometimes they put a cramp on my thighs. They like to let me know I'm not alone. People expect me to always be out and about, but I have a wood walking in me. I'm married to wolves. I made a pact with their pack. If I do get out, I worry about getting back. I can teach research, but have to work much harder at its application. In the morning, as the blue light lurches through the curtains, yellowy monsters I made in my hypnagogic lab overnight put their paws over my eyes, and I feel the tiny hooks in the centers of their palms reaching under my eyelids. I shake them off, pull on my loose rehearsal shirt and trousers. It's too hot for socks. The bright world outside is packed with giant spiders and sylphs. At midday, after making coffee, I sit with them in our yard, and the water spilling from the plant pots spells out on slate what I have to write in the afternoon. The monsters put my eyeballs back in. Wolfram filament burns to light my writing. With spit and spite in tails, the kindly demons illuminate a new diagram, and so the work restarts, under the witness of whitewash herring gulls, curious plaster eye holes, and checkerboard butterflies.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've got more questions, but I won't ask them because I don't want to run up loads of time. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
Pleasure.
thank you, Bob. And Natalie, you're not on the video, but are you on? Would you like to ask your question? You've got a good one. You don't have to show yourself.
Hi.
Oh, well, you are now.
No, it's fine. I just had it turned off because I share an office. But yes, no, I very much enjoyed hearing your poem. It reminded me a lot of kind of found poetry that's used in various different methodologies. There's some correlations as well there with kind of phenomenological approaches that I found quite interesting, and I was just kind of was keen to hear more about the approach you took, particularly with that poem. Did you set out specifically to form something of someone else's words, or did it just kind of come to you when you've been reading these texts and you thought, oh, these might work nicely together? Did you take that physical approach you were talking about before, where you were chopping up these texts, or I'm just fascinated. I would love to hear more about it.
I think that poem came out of another project, Natalie. I was asked to write a chapter in one of these monster Routledge collections, I think, on walking, and I wanted to look at more conventional forms of walking. So I wanted to contrast sort of radical walkers, and then how did their work or how did their walking contrast with what we might see as more conventional, more traditional kind of rambling or touristic walking. So as part of that, I assembled a huge, collection of different kinds of guidebooks that were essentially advising people for what I think you might call traditional rambles or countryside walks or touristic walks, that sort of thing. And I think after I'd written it, I sort of thought, actually, there's a sort of weird kind of poetry to some of this. There's a lot of the time, in trying to be as kind of straightforward and informative as possible, the writers kind of sort of stray into often kind of slightly strange, surreal territory. Or sometimes there's just the irony of people not quite able to know what it is that they're, or not quite to grasp the significance of what they're saying. I mean, some of the stuff around the assumption that people will be using motor cars, for example, that sort of, there's a sort of irony there. So so I just felt that it was really useful material to be drawing on, and so that's what got me going. And I don't think there was anything particularly radical in the way that I assembled the poem, except that I was sort of juggling huge numbers of books and pamphlets and whatever, putting them down, and then sort of having the fun of arranging and rearranging them. Yeah, hopefully that sort of answers what you're getting at.
Well, that's really great, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about that juxtaposition. It's something that struck me when you mentioned it. The kind of mythogeographical approach really contrasts with that almost top-down technocratic feeling that those texts have, where they're prescribing how you should walk it, and it's not about engaging with the environment, it's making sure you tick off the items on the list. So it's really interesting, and I'd love to see the chapter. Did you say it was a chapter that you'd
yeah,
written on that?
Yeah, I can't remember the title of it. It's something like Radical Walkers and something, and it was in a collection. Oh, I can't even remember who edited it now. Michael. No, it's going to go. But it was in something like the Routledge Book of Walking or something like that. It was one of these monstrous Routledge collections, and most of the chapters in there are pretty much about what we might see as fairly conventional walking practices. And so I was obviously invited in as the clown to have some strange chapter in it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Bob, yeah, Bob, I don't know. I know you said you could. You had another question or so. I mean, you haven't gone to the beach. Do you want to punch?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Merleau-Ponty in the Phenomenology of Perception talks about hallucinations. Now, I believe hallucinations to be the future of artistic practice. When you're talking in that last poem that you used, it was almost an eternal hallucinatory experience that you were monitoring. Now, that's your experience, but someone else seeing a hallucination isn't seeing the hallucination, is just seeing you. Now, as a step up from a two-dimensional painting, which is a viewed experience, we're seeing hallucination now as an internal experience. So to me, that's a development in modern art. Now, do you think, anyhow, I believe that's a sort of the growth area into something more radical in Western art, perhaps. Do you have any opinion on that?
I don't see the hallucination as being only internal. These sort of stone giants, they actually are around my bed, and I do get interrupted on my walks by what I would call that's why I call it cast of characters. So there is there are characters, and they and sometimes they manifest in very physical ways, and sometimes they sort of hang around somewhere in between hallucination and physical encounter. And then there are sort of in between zones where it doesn't really matter and everybody can meet on similar terms. So hypnagogia or hypnopompia those states between waking and sleeping, or sleeping and waking, I very consciously use those for, well, I'm not really in control of it when I'm going to sleep, because I don't quite know when that moment is going to happen. But normally for a few minutes before I go to sleep, and sometimes anything between 20 minutes and an hour when I wake up in the morning, and I'm actually thinking about the next thing that I'm going to be writing or working on. And so a lot of this stuff gets written in that in a state that's somewhere between sleeping and waking. So I think I mean, I've no idea where art or anything else is going. I don't even know where I'm going most of the time. But one thing that I work towards all the time is breaking down, or seeking to break down, the distinctions between these zones of experience, the material and the immaterial, the imagination and the social.
Do you think in terms of sharing, there would be some way of aligning hypnographic, I can't remember the word, but in that between waking and sleeping, align it between other people? Because, you know, I don't know how to do it, but is there be like we'll be in a mutual whatever it is state, and then we can sort of communicate almost through that as a way of
yeah, I mean, there have been these sort of experiments, so to speak, where people all over the world have at the same time agreed to participate in these these experiments or these encounters. I can't remember, Jennifer Dumper, I think her name is, based in California, has run.
What's the name again?
I think it's Jennifer. I think it's something like D-U-E. My memory. D-U-M-P-E-R-T, something like that. Her partner is Eric Davies, the technosis person. Yeah, Jennifer I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's something like D-U-M-P-U-E-R-T. I think it's something like that. Anyway, she's done a lot of experimentation in that area. You see, the problem with that sort of experiment is, how on earth would you know? Do you know what I mean? How do you set up how do you create the laboratory conditions for something that clearly exceeds the realm of the laboratory? How do you know? You might well have very positive results, but you've got almost certainly no real way of assessing them. So I think I'm sort of more in the kind of the phenomenological realm, the reading results through the body, through the experience, and then you're in a subjective. You've got to admit to the subjectivity of what you're whatever you're claiming. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, pleasure, Bob.
Oh, well done, Natalie, in finding the chapter. She's popped that in the chat. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. I love the titles of many of your books: Walking, Stumbling, Limping, Falling, or Counter-Tourism, a handbook, which is a man after my own heart there. So I want to imagine you're on the desert island and you've got your books around you. Which is the one you would save as the sea level rose?
Okay, difficult. I think I would probably. It would either be the mythogeography book that I wrote, I think, in 2010, which has sort of got a lot of the basic ideas and experiences and stories from which I've been pushing off from ever since. Or it might be the book I wrote fairly recently called Living in the Magical Mode, which is or pretends to be a series of accounts by people who are trying to conduct the sort of experiments that I was just talking with Bob about there, who get themselves into terrible tangles and have various experiences which they can't really account for. The book is a combination of real things that I've either experienced or tripped over on my walks, and some fictioning. And but the fictioning things are real things, fiction, so to speak. So it's not fantasy. And I don't really know what I think about a lot of the things in that book. So I think if I was on the desert island, the one book is a pushing off from, but the other book, the later Living in the Magical Mode, would be more a sort of a series of questions that I might try to think about or experiment with on the island. Not sure I'd be very good on an island, but yeah.
The last word goes to Phil.
Okay, so I just end on a poem. So a bit more sort of magic. Yeah, rather I was going to read one about sort of nearly being run down in a country lane, but I think this is more upbeat, even if the title's a bit odd. So it's Shadow Elite, and this is it. I was walking in the garden last night when the trees began to conspire. I told my neighbour, but he said, that's just the wind, the way it blows, the fool. I've seen this all before. The useful idiot next door played by the breeze in the interest of the trees. This morning, my neighbour was taking tea with flowers. He thinks his garden is Eden now and has been erecting a wire fence all afternoon. Soon the cameras will come. He fears that foxes want to steal his blooms. Tonight, when it's dark again, his dinner party will reconvene. The guests arrive in masks and fancy dress. They look like fools come to play poker and blackjack. They carry knives they never need to use. No one knows where they live or their real names, but the rumor is that they are from the same 7 families, older than time, that long ago invested in seeds. In the spring, all the farmers go to them, cap in hand, and beg to join the monopoly for another year. I've heard they sacrifice rare beasts and preach extinction as a means to resurrection to a better place where their sins become cherry blossom. Later tonight, when their part is over, I will have my usual meeting with the snake. We've been planning for a while now ways to worm our way into their heaven and plant it out with apples. In my dreams, I'll squeeze their necks of corn, bring their harvest in. The moon will smile coolly on, and by the time the sun comes in, this world will be unrecognizable.
Well, thank you, sir. Very good.
Thank you.
Very entertaining guest.